Aid and trade. How Australia spends money overseas on aid projects for political purposes and cuts spending on poverty reduction programs. We turn a critical eye on our aid spending. From Melbourne, you're watching The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea. For this week's episode, we're joined by Thulsi Narayanasamy from AidWatch. Thulsi is a director at AidWatch, Australia's independent monitor of international aid and trade policy. For over 20 years, AidWatch has demanded transparency and accountability for Australia's foreign aid and trade. We start today's program looking at Australia's foreign aid spending and how it fits into the picture more generally. Australia ranks 14th globally in its spending on foreign aid as a percentage of gross national income, devoting 0.27%, compared to the UK, which spends almost double that, and Sweden, which spends over 4 times as much. Under the current budget, Australia's spending will fall from 0.27% to just 0.22%. There's no doubt these are big cuts, but perhaps what is more troubling is the new paradigm set up by the Abbott government to steer funding of projects in line with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade objectives. Thulsi, can you please tell us a bit more about what we mean when we talk about this new paradigm?
Yeah, absolutely. So the new aid paradigm was introduced under the Abbott government when they were first elected. One of the big things that they did was to subsume AusAid into the Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade, and that was largely done with the thinking on behalf of the government and the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, to subsume the aid objectives into foreign policy objectives. So the aid program's always operated with a tension between poverty alleviation as well as Australia's national interest. So it's always been this really tricky which one kind of comes first. But that tension has always meant that there'll be some good programs and some programs that clearly are operating in the national interest. What we now see with the new aid paradigm is that that tension has largely been eliminated, and all of the aid program is now largely falling in line with Australia's national interests and the interests of the private sector. And poverty reduction measures have largely taken a backward step, or they're seen as mutually reinforcing with the interests of the private sector and economic growth. There's very little evidence to support these kinds of claims, and they haven't really provided very much evidence to support that, which is really unfortunate. And what has happened now is, because of the loss of staff and expertise from that department, it's considered quite normal then to pursue Australia's objectives. So what we're seeing is aid for trade now becoming 20% of the aid program, so projected $1 billion of spending annually. And what that allows the Australian government to do is basically pursue its free trade agreement. So the PACER Plus agreement is currently being negotiated between Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Island countries. There's been a lot of debate, fiercely, particularly in the Pacific Islands, about the fact that this trade agreement is not a development agreement. It's largely an agreement that has Australia's interests and the New Zealand interests at heart. But Australia's being able to leverage their needs because of the aid element. And we're seeing that happen across a range of objectives that are coming under the aid program.
Is that common? I mean, do we see that in other countries, that that's the direction that they're taking, or is Australia it seems like quite an aggressive policy to link aid and trade in that way, and I just wonder how common that is globally.
No, it's certainly following a trend that's happening overseas. So, for example, the Canadian government have also made a very similar move, and for similar reasons. DFAT and the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade actually have a memorandum of understanding, and they seem to be following very similar policy moves. So from the perspective of AidWatch, it's quite useful because we can look to what's happening in Canada to determine what's happening, what could happen in the future within Australia, and that's actually served as quite a useful benchmark. So particularly with the preferencing and platforming of the private sector as a central element of the aid program, that's something that certainly happened also in Canada. So the private sector have always been involved in the aid program really heavily. There's this term boomerang aid, which came about as a result of a really large number of consultancies from companies that form a part of the aid program. So all of that money is then remitted back to Australia through these companies. So they've always played a role, but I think now platforming them even further and so sort of saying that they're going to be the bringers of development where, you know, no one else has been able to before is quite audacious, and it's actually quite dangerous, we think, particularly in the absence of looking at what the track record of the private sector their involvement in developing countries. So we're quite concerned to see that there's this really uncritical approach to the involvement of the private sector. And, you know, Julie Bishop goes so far as to say that they're a force for good, and really doesn't want to be engaging with some of the issues.
Can you tell me a bit about AidWatch and what its actual objectives are?
Yeah, so AidWatch was formed 20 years ago, and we basically are an independent monitor of Australia's foreign aid and trade. And we examine where aid money is spent, as well as working alongside affected communities and local NGOs to report back to Australia on what some of these issues are. So some of the current campaign areas that we've got, one of them is our Land is Life campaign. So that's looking at land reform programs that are funded by the Australian government in Melanesia, particularly in Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. So in those countries, customary land or communal land tenure is the way that most of the land in those countries are operated under. And there's a real push from the Australian government, and a real historical push that came from many years ago, to privatise land. So it's considered an impediment to development to have customary land tenure, to have an Indigenous way of life. And so much effort is put into privatising land to allow things like logging, mining, tourism, these kinds of things to happen. And a lot of the time that's against the wishes of the people on the ground. So we work in partnership with them to challenge some of these policies and some of the underlying ideology that's coming out of not only the Australian government, but also Australian educational institutions that really form a large part of the thinking behind aid policy.
Can you tell me whether you think all aid spending is necessarily beneficial, or how you measure that?
Yeah, so definitely not would be the answer. I think, you know, thinking about who aid is beneficial to, you know, when the objective of the aid program is to pursue Australia's national interest, you must consider how beneficial it is to Australia in the first instance. And I think the answer to that question is very. I don't think we can ever underestimate the effectiveness of foreign aid as a tool for soft diplomacy, or to be able to leverage Australia's other national interests, which we see happening right across this region for our domestic border policy, border protection policy, as well as for trade interests and other economic interests like mining or logging. And then I guess the question of, is it beneficial for the most marginalised people in the world, is a far more complex answer, I think. There are definitely programs that occur under the aid program, health programs, education programs, sanitation programs, that are very effective and have really contributed to really significant development outcomes, undoubtedly, across the region. But a really large chunk of the aid program is absolutely not spent on these parts. They're spent on, for example, aid for trade, which I already mentioned, and other parts like subsidising the corporate social responsibility programs of extractive industries and a whole range of other things. And I think the big thing that needs to be noted is that there's very little accountability or transparency that happens with aid spending. So it's very difficult to actually be able to say what's actually happening under the aid program, because we don't really know for a lot of the time. We get a pie chart, we get a breakdown of governance, law and justice, all of these things, and millions and millions of dollars, and we can't really say what the outcomes of that really are, or what even the objectives of those programs are. So that's probably the biggest challenge that we face in even being able to assess how effective aid really is.
You're watching The World from Below, and we'll be back to discuss some of the controversies arising from Australia's foreign aid programs after the break.